Afternoon, everybody. This is Kiana, and today we're delving deeply into the Sonya Massey shooting. So, if you've been away for some time, or maybe you don't follow the news, this is a very important story that deals with a young Black woman who was unfortunately gunned down by law enforcement officers in the United States. So, let's get into the facts of this case. So Sonia Massey called law enforcement for their assistance and their protection. She was under the impression that there was an intruder in the area and that her home was being broken into, and called law enforcement to see if they could actually come and uh, scope out the place. When law enforcement arrived, her uh, claims were uh, meritorious because there was a car that was broken into. There were two shattered windows, and there was shattered glass on the pavement. And so it does appear that there was an intruder in the neighborhood, and that Sonia Massey was thinking clearly about this particular situation. Now, the officers decided to see exactly where this call was coming from. So they were knocking on doors, and Sonia was a little late to answer the door. And that is because she was not dressed decently. So we understand by watching and examining the body worn camera footage that this was the case. Sonia said, I needed to get dressed. I wasn't dressed appropriately. Or I'm paraphrasing, but in essence, what Sonia was telling the law enforcement officers is that she wasn't dressed appropriately. And so law enforcement continued to ask if she made the phone calls, and she expressed that she did. And before she invited law enforcement officers into her home, you could see where she was coming from. Her mode of thinking was calm. It was measured. She said, "I love you guys. I love you guys." And you can see at that moment that she wasn't belligerent, wasn't combative. She was a very calm, meek person, just calling to get assistance from law enforcement in a time of need. So when she invited law enforcement officers into her home, they were asking her a series of questions. And Sonia was late to respond to these questions. She was on the phone with dispatch, and she said, I need to get my paper, I need to get my documents. And you can see that dispatch and both Sean Patrick Grayson, uh, what they did was they were impatient with Sonia. And despite her being calm and patient and uh, relying on them for their assistance, Sean was quite impatient with her. And so the next part of the body worn camera footage is that Sonia, uh, Grayson instructs Sonia to remove a pot of boiling water from her stove. And she follows the instructions. She goes to her stove, turn it off. She removes the pot of boiling water and says, "Are you afraid?" What was it? Are you afraid of boiling water? Because I took this to mean that she had a pot of boiling water on her stove because she was either cooking, preparing a meal for herself, uh, preparing food, or maybe even boiling a pot of tea. And so what I did was I took this to mean it was quite possible that Sonia felt that Officer Grayson was delaying her preparedness, her meal, and delaying her possibly boiling a pot of coffee for tea. Excuse me, boiling a pot for tea. So it from this particular part of the body worn camera footage, I got the impression the that Sonya was being inquisitorial about why he was asking her to remove this pot from her stove. And so from that point, Sonya looked up at Grayson, and I don't know if he was looking at her aggressively. We don't really see his face, but she looked up at him and she said, "I rebuke you in the name of Jesus." And she said that twice. "I rebuke you in the name of Jesus." And I don't know about you, but uh, I, as a young child, my family was in the Jehovah Witness Church. We all often went to baptism. We had friends that were Baptists, and I often visited their church as well. And what I come to understand about this precise moment is that in this time in my life and growing up in a Black family, excuse me, growing up in a Black family, this is pretty common. This "I rebuke you in the name of Jesus." I heard this statement from some pastors, churchgoers. I've heard this from many people. This is a common pronunciation and phraseology in the Black American community. So it raises questions as to why Grayson was so offended by this. He was so offended that he took his firearm out of the holster, pointed it at Sonya, and said, "You better not." And it's not immediately clear as to what he was thinking in that moment, because the video is not showing that Sonya is trying to do anything to harm this officer. And we understand that quite clearly because Sonya says, "I'm sorry." And she takes her pot, drops to the ground, and covers herself. And we know that Grayson comes from the area where he is currently at. And then he comes around and then he shoots Sonya 3 times. Now, the family has received conflicting information about what caused Sonia's unalivement. So let's listen to that now.
It's under investigation. And then they said that they told the doctor, the hospital, that she committed suicide first. And then they changed it. They kept
didn't
changing
even call
their
me and
story.
tell me. They didn't. Yeah, they just kept, because they told her that, but they called me. The hospital told me that someone just shot her. So they just telling everybody different stories. We're gonna get justice.
So did you hear that? Law enforcement told the family that Sonya actually took her own life. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is quite dangerous statement in the Black American community, because often what we know is that when it comes to Black Americans and when it comes to people that are experiencing mental health conditions, what often happens is that law enforcement will use the victim's mental health status as a excuse for taking their life. For example, I could clearly see that what they were trying, one can just infer that from that first statement that they were considering telling the family that Sonya unalived herself or took her own life. And the justification that they probably would have given the family is that Sonya was experiencing a mental health condition and that she couldn't cope, when that wasn't the facts of this particular case. And it was quite evident that Sonya was coping and that she wasn't trying to take her life. So that story didn't work. And then we heard the statement from her son, which they told her they were informed that Sonya, someone else took Sonya's life. Uh, an intruder took Sonya's life, and the father corroborates this statement that he was informed as well that an intruder got into Sonya's house, broke into it, and unalived her. And we know that that was not the facts of this case. It was the officer who actually unalived this young woman. So, what I've been doing is just a moment. There we go. The text was hiding on us, everybody, but I fixed it. Okay, so what I was trying to understand is why was Grayson so offended by this statement and or this phrase? And as I explained, when you're growing up in the church, especially if you're in the Black community, you hear this, I rebuke you in the name of Jesus. You hear that, that's very common. But I wanted to look into this issue, so I went to the internet and I found just some misleading information online. So what I did was I came to the library and I decided, let me go ahead and look into this situation deeply. And that's what I did is I actually consulted to very old books and texts to help me understand this situation. So let's get into it. So the word rebuke is found in the Bible in several different parts and books in the Bible, but I think that the one that's most consistent with what happened and how Sonya Massey was expressing herself was in Titus 1:13, and that is, this testimony is true, therefore rebuke them sharply that they may be sound in faith. And so what I did was I said, what does this sentence mean? Like what is this chapter trying to tell its audience? And I went to Bible reference, and it said that the sentence means the claim to truth is a reference for verse 12 in Paul's quote. This writer referred to the Cretans as liars, evil beasts, and lazy gluttons. And uh, they go on to say, how was Titus to respond to people who acted in such ways? Paul commanded Titus to rebuke them. And this word is from the Greek elcho, which implies a sense of challenging, shaming, correcting, and exposing. So this meaning is similar to scold, but with an emphasis on teaching more than punishing. So you kind of see that this is really where Sonya was coming from. It was kind of a correcting, like there was it was quite plausible that Grayson was in an aggressive stance or possibly looking at her aggressively. We don't know because we weren't able to see his face. But to be sure, to be sure, I don't know what happened with this slide, but let's fix it right fast. It's no biggie. Let's just move this over. Let's fix that. Okay, there we go. That looks better. I think because I actually saved this as a PDF, the the text changed in transition. I'm not sure, but anyway, it looks better now. It says, what does rebuke mean biblically? And as I said, I consulted some sources, and rebuke from a biblical perspective means to decide, to judge, to reprove, and to correct. And although the Old Testament tells us that human rebuking is, or rebuking humans and rebuking each other is unjustified, it also, Mark and Luke, in those books, we can see that it says that if it's coming from, or rather, if it's brotherly correction, it is sometimes necessary. So that's what I think that Sonya Massey was trying to do, is she was just trying to correct maybe what she felt was an aggressive situation coming on to her. And let's move on. Now, I want you to listen. I really want you to listen what Sonia's father says here. Just a moment.
It's just flabbergasting. It's crazy. I've never seen anything like this. And if we pass the George Floyd Policing Act, if this is a catalyst to pass our John Lewis voting rights bill, this is a catalyst to get Kamala Harris as our next president. It won't bring my baby back.
My heart goes out to him. Like, this is such a heartbreaking time. I understand. So he says that what we could do is we could pass the George Floyd Policing Act. And the question is, can we change these incidents legislatively? And the answer is yes on one hand, and the answer is no on one hand. No, because this particular act needs and requires bilateral support in Congress. And we understand that there are Republicans and some Democrats, not all, but some Democrats do not want more liability for law enforcement. So this bill is still and remains in its introductory phase. And that's quite unfortunate, but that is where it stands now, is that it's going to be very difficult to get legislation moved through Congress because Republicans don't want more restrictions on police officers. And I want you to listen to something.
With the mentally ill.
Yeah.
So that aspect, I do feel for cops, but there should be that's what some of that money, instead of buying tanks, more guns for police, let's get it into some social workers, some therapists who you can call that can handle that situation.
Well, a lot of liberal-led entities push for that type of stuff. More training with cops, with sensitivity training, stuff like that. But Republicans always shoot it down. We don't need that. We need tougher cops. We need tougher police, tougher on crime. And I'm not.
So, as you can see, he's right. Republicans, they do shoot a lot of the legislation down that protects the community. They really do. And I agree in part that we need more funding to be allocated toward organizations and programs that addresses mental health conditions. And what I mean by that is that mental health conditions are not a policing issue. Mental health conditions are a public health issue. And this, of course, it's a health issue. It's not a policing issue. So there shouldn't be law enforcement coming to the streets or knocking on a resident's door. If they really need to speak with a therapist, they need to speak with someone to talk about their concerns, what they're going through. And I think that it's unfortunate that law enforcement officers are on the streets and that they have been tasked to handle the complaints of citizens who are experiencing a mental health episode. But further, what I disagree with in that video is that I don't think that there needs to be more training. There is enough training. Law enforcement officers are being trained. They need to apply the training that they have that's coming under the department. There is training that is in place that needs to be applied. And in Sonya Massey's case, I am quite certain that Grayson was trained. He has been to several different departments. He's worked at several different policing departments. So yeah, I'm quite certain that he has been trained. So gunning down this young woman should not have been the first line of defense for him. He should have used less aggressive and less lethal means if that was warranted. But of course, in this particular situation, from reviewing the body-worn camera footage, we see that lethal force and excessive force was not warranted in this situation. Now let's move forward. Okay, so can we change these incidents legislatively? I already said on one hand, no, but on the other, yes, we can actually, because the White House has the power to stop police violence through its extra constitutional powers. Now, what are extra constitutional powers? Extra constitutional powers are powers that can be exercised by the president, even if not specifically mentioned in the Constitution. Now, Richard Pius, in his book, The American Presidency, tells us that the president alone exercises the remainder of sovereign powers not mentioned in the Constitution. So, yes, the president can protect Americans from this epidemic of police violence that is happening in the United States. And to Sonya Massey's, to the point that Sonya Massey's father made about, or we'll get into that, but now the White House can also protect Americans from police violence through its emergency powers. So in crises, the Constitution permits the president to exercise legislative and judicial powers granted to the other branches. Now, we understand that there is a separation of powers within the United States, but in crisis situations, the Constitution allows the president to exercise legislative functioning and judicial functioning to protect the public. We understand this to be certain. And how do we know this? So, this is called the doctrine of emergency powers. And what this does is that it assumes that the president must go beyond the bounds set by the Constitution or laws to preserve the Union. Now, John Locke, he stated very clearly that in dire emergency, the laws themselves gives way to the executive power, or rather to this fundamental law of nature and government that, as much as it may be, all the members of society are to be preserved. Now, Locke went on to say that this prerogative permits the executive to act according to discretion for public good. and with prescription of law. So to the point that Sonya's father is making is that we need to elect Vice President Kamala Harris. Well, Vice President Kamala Harris is currently in office, and Joe Biden was in office for 4 years, and they had the opportunity to make these changes, and actually they can make it now. And this isn't any criticism upon the Biden administration. I'm stating that they have the power to enact this change now. They have extra constitutional powers and they have emergency powers. It has already been documented that police violence in the United States is a public health concern. So, if it's a public health concern, then the presidency, that's Kamala Harris, who is now the nominee, she should not wait to exercise her emergency powers and her extra constitutional powers to stop this police violence that is happening to American citizens, especially Black Americans who are disproportionately impacted by this violence. And so we'll move forward. Now, where is an example of this? So Lincoln justifies actions. He justified the actions that he took after the break of the Civil War by claiming that the emergency made it necessary for him to exercise legislative powers until he could call into Congress. He could call Congress into session. So as you can see, the president has vast powers and can actually today help protect us from police violence. And that's all we're asking. We're asking to be protected from police violence. And the president has the power to do it. We understand that Donald Trump is not going to do it because Donald Trump has specifically stated that he wants to give more power to police officers, and that's not going to protect us. So where we stand now is we have to rely on Kamala Harris, that she is going to enact this change or exercise her uh, executive power to protect Americans from police violence. Okay, so let's continue. Now, how do we legitimize presidential prerogatives? So, this is how the Constitution does give the president wide discretion and great power. And according to PS, he states that it ought to do so. For example, Richard Pius tells us that, or Richard Pius tells us that the president is the agent of the people for the work that they wish to perform. The people entrust to the president not simply the freedom to act, but also the power to define the scope of their authority, subject to subsequent challenge by Congress or the decision of the courts. So the president must stake out their claim to presidential powers. And so, as you can see, it's important for the president to stake out her claim to these powers to protect Americans from this police violence. Is well within Vice President Kamala Harris's power if she becomes the president. It was within the Biden administration's or President Joe Biden's power. There were 4 years in which he could have actually used his executive power to enact this change. But now is the time for President Kamala Harris to do that. It is the time for her to use her extra constitutional powers. It's time for her to use her emergency powers to show Americans that she really has our back. It's well within the power of the office of the president. And I think it's important that she exercise her power. So this has been a deep analysis into the Sonya Massey incident, and there are going to be other videos that are going to be reflecting situations in which we are talking about human rights and the rights of human rights defenders and people that are impacted by police violence in the United States. I hope you have a good day. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Again, it is at Real Kiana Canada. That is at Real Kiana Canada. And you can also follow me on Twitter at Kiana_Canada. Again, that is Kiana_Canada. Bye-bye.